As you are hearing, transactional analysis started as a way of addressing psychotherapy. It's also applied in educational settings and in organizational settings. So as you are listening and trying on the information, and you think about the work that you might be doing to help organizations change, just keep aware of that reality, that it can be, it's about any way in which human beings are interacting with each other and with systems. And I think you spoke about how TA has often not been given its due. I think psychology in general, social science, with respect to other kinds of science, also aren't given their due. So I'm just inviting you to think about it both specifically and in the general sense, which is another social application. To the extent that the world doesn't value how human beings interact in general, then you can see the links, I think.
And it's almost getting to the point where the world doesn't value human beings.
Exactly. Well, that's the other thing. That's another level.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think this information is very timely.
Yes, it is for many, many reasons. Totally,
Right.
Totally.
So currently you can be certified in one of 4 areas: psychotherapy, counseling, organizational development, or educational applications. So that's why Byrne initially called this a method of social psychiatry. He really realized the application, as Val said, to any area where human beings are dealing with one another.
I just thought of one other thing, that when you spoke about the fact that when Byrne started, that he saw reducing infant mortality as critical.
Yeah.
Right now in the US, there is so much work about addressing infant mortality and about the continued reality that black babies are much less likely to thrive.
Right.
And he said this in the 50s, as I'll be talking. I mean, we have been stuck on this phenomenon of how do we address social and economic injustice. And so again, the model speaks to what the goal is and the work that hopefully all of us will keep doing to help achieve that goal, which is infant mortality is a way of talking about when that is addressed, all these other things will have been addressed.
Have you noticed where the United States is in the ranking of infant mortality? This is a very backward country.
Right.
And precisely but in Sex and Human Loving is where he introduces this again. He talks about it in the TA Bulletin back in the early 60s. Mm-hmm. There were 2 things that needed to be done, he said. One was reduce the infant mortality. If what you're doing doesn't do that, there's something wrong with what you're doing.
Right.
And the other was to put 2 pieces of art on the walls of every consulting room of every mental health agency in the United States, I could say the world. And I mean, that was important because
right.
There you've got the ethical side and the aesthetic side.
Right.
And I think it's very important to emphasize in Byrne both the ethical and the aesthetic side, that he had an appreciation for beauty and for the aesthetics of living.
Right.
And the importance of the art on the walls. That's also very healing.
So I want to give you a definition of transactional analysis. It is both a theory of personality and human interaction and a method of psychotherapy, as well as a method of counseling, organizational analysis, and educational facilitation. And it's made up of 4 basic parts. The first is called structural analysis, and that is looking at the human personality, the structure of the personality based on the concept of ego states, and how those ego states function intrapsychically. The second area is called transactional analysis proper, and that looks at what takes place between individuals as they interact with one another. Byrne called this a transaction as opposed to an interaction because he realized that both parties were getting something out of that. There was an exchange of strokes as well as other benefits in that process. Transactional analysis proper looks at how communication takes place or doesn't take place, and also how it takes place on more than one level, on both what he called the social level and the psychological level. And what he pointed out was that the outcome is going to be determined by what's going on the psychological level, not the social level. So it's not so much what people say that's critical, it's what is implied by what they're saying. Like if I say, "What time is it?" What am I really saying? Well, I'm probably implying you're late if you come in a few minutes late. So I'm asking a question, but I'm really making a statement. A lot of communication is delivered on that psychological level. A third basic part is what's called life script analysis, and that looks at how people tend to live out their lives based on early decisions they make in childhood, often that they are not aware of in the present. And the purpose of life script analysis is to bring that early life plan into conscious awareness so we have choice about what we're doing in the present and not simply unconsciously following a plan that we're not aware of. And then the fourth area is called game and racket analysis, and these are psychological mechanisms that people use to try to make the external world fit their internal script beliefs in order to justify the script. Since the script is based on survival, then we keep trying to make the world the way it was when we grew up to justify the methods we use to try to survive and take care of ourselves. So we will be talking about each of these as we go along. TA is based on three very important philosophical principles. The first of these is human beings are okay. Now that is a statement of essence, not a statement of behavior. It means that each of us have basic worth, value, and dignity as human beings. A friend of mine used to like to say, "I'm okay, you're okay, bastards though we may be." We may be behaving in very bad ways, but we have the potential to behave differently because our basic essence is okay. The second one is that everyone has the capacity to think. In psychoanalytic theory, people talk about folks having a weak ego. In transactional analysis, Byrne realized that everyone has a fully developed adult ego state. They may not be using it, but it's there in potential, and they can be taught to use it and to operate very effectively in the world. And third, that dysfunctional behavior results from early decisions made in childhood that at the time were the very best option the child had available for taking care of him or herself. And the problem is that these decisions often limit oneself in the present and can be redecided. A simple example of that is if I grew up in a family that was very abusive, and it was very painful to live in that family, I may have learned to really exclude my feelings and numb out and not allow myself to feel my emotions, which served me well in my family of origin to prevent all the pain I would have experienced otherwise. But as an adult, my emotions are what help me recognize what my needs are. And they also motivate me to get my needs met. So if I don't let myself feel my feelings, I won't know what I need, and I won't be motivated to take action to get my needs met. So that becomes very problematic, and I will need to learn how to access my feelings again in order to really take care of my needs as a grown-up. There are many things like that that we decide in childhood that serve us well that now get in our way as adults.
TA is a contractual model, And it's based on that equality that you've been talking about the whole time, and that this whole 101 is about in terms of inclusion and equality. And that is that you include the other, there's a contract about, first of all, whether you're going to do therapy or you're going to do an intervention. The contract is important in order to include both parties in the conversation and the dialogue.
What are some practices for accessing and growing my intuition? So I have an intuitive practice as well. And so hearing that he has an intuitive practice, or he had one, and the way that it was incorporated into the ego states, how would I begin, obviously reading the book, but how could I begin practicing, growing my intuition? What were his ideas around how he honed in his capacity to tap into that within himself?
Good.
I think as we go through ego states and transactions and script, all of those are based on the importance of intuition and children's intuition, and how important it is and how often it gets discouraged as we get older. But I think we will be touching on intuition throughout the theory.
Byrne used to talk about how a little kid might be sitting and listening to a bird sing, just intuiting the essence of that experience. And mother comes along and says, "Birdie, birdie, birdie," and the child has to stop being in touch with the experience and start thinking, birdie, birdie, associating the sound with the bird, which is a cognitive activity. And really gets out of touch with his or her intuition. And Burns said the best psychiatrist in the world is a 4-year-old who just reads people and knows what's going on outside of what people are saying. And I think a good way to practice that is to do what Byrne talked about in terms of thinking Martian. Imagine you were Martian who didn't know the language and you just watch people. And just practice watching people and watch what they do and think about what are they implying, what's being implied through what they're doing versus what they're maybe actually saying on a social level. I think that's one of the best ways of doing it. And you can practice that daily, just in your observations.
Would you say that kind of moving into the child ego state would be a part of that?
Intuition really comes from our feelings, the child is the part of us that's most in touch with our original feelings. Yeah, spontaneous feelings.
I'm taking in the first philosophical principle of human beings are okay. And the explanation that I've heard here today is a little different from the assumptions I made about that phrase of okayness.
It's one of the most misunderstood statements of all in TA, I think.
Great,
People
I'm
think
glad.
it refers to behavior.
And also, I think what I misunderstood was that it was a judgment about someone's goodness. I think I was thinking in terms of goodness, badness. And so I would like to hear someone talk a little bit more about that principle, because what I'm hearing today is that it's really about inherent dignity and worth. And,
Right,
and I
value.
guess in response to my question, if someone could also include how it's helpful to use the terminology okay, because it has been tripping me up till now. So I'd like to understand the use of it.
Okay.
I think we will be talking about okayness a lot in transactions for sure. But in terms of what was the question, how to access it? I think behaviorally. I think the way to practice okayness is by how we behave with each other in terms of mirroring living from our okayness and mirroring it to each other. And I think that we will be touching on it a lot more as we talk about transactions themselves.
TA has been used a lot in the context of spirituality and religion to speak about the worth of our soul, the worth of our spirit. So that's what it's okayness in that sense. We're calling it essence. And in our work we talk about when working around issues of oppression, that we assume that people aren't born with negative as a racist or heterosexist, but that it's something we learn, that each baby is born into the world is okay. And so the issue is how do the world creates the systems and structures of the society set us up to catch the not okay positions that we take. and those are existential positions, and that our essence is okay. And that is a philosophical position that allows me, for instance, not to be a bigot against bigots, or not to become the oppressor. And so all the work around challenging the oppressor in ourselves connects to addressing the humanness that we each have. Yeah, yeah.
Just because I didn't hear a response to this, has anyone found it useful to use alternate languaging?
So for me, it's about claiming the language
Claiming
and
the
defining it
okayness.
in the way that I'm talking about.
Thank you.
It's one of those things that, I mean, English is a hard language for some of this. I mean, so again, as we go into other languages, there are other ways of talking about it. Ubuntu, if you know the South African phenomenon about love, the loving in each person, and in other languages, there are words that are easier. And I think that one of our Western flaws is keep trying to figure out the language. So I like to say, this is how I'm using it. And then the transaction is, how do you use it? And that's why we do, and this interaction is the process. And that's a process. And it's not there's no one, like, but we in dialogue continue to be in relationship to that.